Hello there, and welcome to Casual Fridays, the podcast where themes are discussed through personal anecdotes and experiences and storytelling. I am your host, Dada, and this podcast is part of my I Read Aloud channel. And on my channel, I usually read fairy tales, short stories, sometimes children's stories, and poems. So if you like such kind of content, please do subscribe to my channel. And don't forget that every Friday I will drop a new episode in my podcast or for my podcast, Casual Fridays. Today's episode is titled Solitude and Aloneness. And I know it's a bit redundant because solitude is all about being alone, but I want to delineate between aloneness and loneliness because people always confuse the two and think that it's one and the same thing. In fact, loneliness has all sorts of negative connotations attached to it, such as boredom and depression, to name a couple. Whereas aloneness is a choice you make to be alone, a choice to be in solitude, a choice to be in one's own company. And when you start loving your own company, believe me, beautiful things will start to unfold in your life. Now, I always like to start my episodes by telling you what inspired the topic. And in fact, it was an interaction I had with my florist, who is an unmarried woman of about 50 years old, who found out that I lived alone and was surprised and wished that she could do that, but she couldn't afford it. And funnily enough, a couple of months ago, a friend of mine visited, a friend of mine who's also an unmarried woman of about 50 years old, who still lives with her parents. And she visited to actually ask me about how it was to live alone. And she thought about it and she decided not to go through with it. And she actually looked me in the eye the next time we met and told me, I am not as brave as you are to take this step. And this might come as a surprise to people living in the West and in Western cultures, because living alone is something that's a natural happening. But we live in the Middle East, and in the Middle East we have certain stricter rules to abide by in society in general. And especially when you talk about situations up until 20 or 30 years ago, it was totally unheard of for an unmarried woman to live alone. A woman was expected to either get married and move from her parents' home to her husband's home, or she would just live in her parents' home until they died or she died. And if they died before her, then two things could happen. If the family finances were good enough, she could stay in her parents' home and live the rest of her life in solitude or alone, in her parents' home. And if the finances did not help, then she would probably have to move in with one of her brothers and help take care of the family and the household there. So, of course, things have changed. Around 15 years ago, it became a bit more acceptable for women to live alone. Nowadays, it's even more acceptable. So, the more time progresses, the more westernization seeps into our culture, things become a bit more acceptable, especially for people who live near the city and in the city. And let's go back to 15 years ago, because that's when I moved out of my parents' house. And at the time, a woman could live alone mainly for two reasons. One, she would either work abroad and therefore have to live abroad alone. She would be studying abroad as well. And of course, when she would come back from her studies or her work abroad to live in her hometown, she was expected to live again in her parents' home. And there was also a bit of a loophole here, because if the family lived in rural areas and the woman had to work in the city and the commute would be so long, then it would be acceptable for the girl to, or for the woman to live alone in the city. Now, In some cases, she would be asked to live, sometimes forced, to live in a convent or in a boarding house where there was a strict curfew. And in a few times, it depends on the family as well, she could live independently in her own apartment. So basically, when I moved out 15 years ago, I was 31. I took that as an excuse that I had work in the city, that the commute was long. Now, it was a bit long. It was between 2 and 3 hours a day going back and forth because of traffic. Without traffic, it would take barely an hour back and forth. But with traffic, it was much worse. And that was the reason I gave when I actually moved out of my parents' house. In a Middle Eastern family, and especially we're talking about before COVID years, now it has become a bit more acceptable. But before the COVID years, have you watched the My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that movie, where you have all sorts of family going in and out of the house, constant partying, not necessarily partying, but constant dinners and lunches and lots of food being prepared? That was basically our household. So my parents have so many friends, and my dad has clients. Then I have two brothers who have their friends, and there are my friends, and so it's all kind of amalgamated into a lot of chaos in the house. At any moment, the phone could ring, or sometimes the phone didn't have to ring even. Someone would knock on the door, a family member would walk in, and then they'd come in for a coffee and stay for dinner, or come in for a coffee and stay for lunch. And so, yeah. Now, of course, my father was upset when I moved out because for him, he did care about what people thought about me, and I understand his viewpoint. He knows how men think, especially, and how people think in society, and he was worried about any backlash I might get, from people. But I've always been a person who tooted her own horn, who just didn't care what people thought, and I just made the move. And a couple of months later, he saw that I was happy living alone, and of course my mom played a big role. Thank you, Mom, in convincing him that it was the right move for me. She had noticed how withdrawn I had become, at home, and how I was trying to escape from all these gatherings, working a full-time job that was highly stressful. I'd go to the office early in the morning, come back sometimes at 8 or 9 at night, and I would really be exhausted. I would just need to get some space to breathe. And she saw how I would sometimes get to the house, go to my room for like an hour, lock myself in, not talk to anybody, and then I'd regain a semblance of energy, and then go out and mingle a little bit with whoever is there. And so my mom knew the importance of my living alone. She saw that I needed it, and she was able to convince my dad that it was okay. And as I was writing this episode, and especially this particular part, I remembered Virginia Woolf, who wrote a 100-page essay titled A Room of One's Own, in which she talks about how women, now of course, she wrote only about women at the time, and in that essay, but she wrote about how women, in order to write, would need money and some space of their own in order to be able to do that. And I found that this applies not only to men but also women, and not only I'm sorry, not women, but also men, and not only to writing but to any situation in life. Because for you to for any human being to evolve and to unleash this tiny genius inside, you need to have some solitude, and you need some time alone. And since I have moved out, I've earned an LLM degree, which is basically a Master of Laws in Business Law. I studied French again and placed in the high intermediate level recently. I studied Italian. I'm still a beginner there. I opened and closed a pie business over the span of 2 years. I edited a couple of books, and I started my I Read Aloud channel, and now I just started my Casual Fridays podcast. And I've done most of this while working a full-time job and sometimes stressful jobs too. But it all happened because I started having time to think. And it's not about just thinking in the sense of replaying ugly situations in your head, or like what happened to you during the day, and just going through it again and again in a loop. No, the idea is to think as in daydreaming. When you were a kid, do you remember when you used to be left alone to play, and you used to live in your little imaginary world, and you used to daydream? And you have to reconnect with that, to your ability to daydream and to allow your mind to wander is a precious thing, because when you create a time and space to daydream and ultimately to dream, you will discover that your dreams will start becoming a reality bit by bit. It will not happen all at once in one day. I mean, we're not talking about a fairy godmother or a genie, but over a year or 2 or 3, you will notice that, oh, I wanted to do that. I really dreamt of that at some point, and now it's happening. And you come to the realization that it was all worth it. That's giving yourself some time to think and to process how you would like your life to be, and to dream is so important for any human being. And it's not all about like the dreams, it's also about self evolvement, self progression. How can you know about who you are, about your beliefs, about your belief system? How can you change some things in your belief system to the better if you don't have time for yourself to think about things a little bit philosophically, probably, if that's the way you want to put it? So believe me, it's very important for you to learn to love your own company, and you have to love your own thoughts. You have to make time for your own company, just as you would make time for everything else and for everyone else. I mean, you make time to go out for a coffee with a friend. You make time to go out for dinner. Sometimes you make time to work out. You make time to cook. The same way you find time for many things, you could find a bit of time for you, for spending time with yourself in silence and peace. I'm not going to say meditation, because that's something that not all people are into, and you don't have to do that in order to be in solitude and be at peace. And basically, I know it is easier to find a time to be in solitude and to be with your own thoughts if you live alone. I mean, yes, I live alone. I don't have a family. I don't have children, and I have friends who have families and kids. And I know how exhausted they get sometimes, how sometimes running the household with a full-time job for both parents is truly exhausting and tiring. And I know that sometimes you might think, what are you talking about? There is no time. How can I find the time? But the thing is, you don't need to find a lot of time. You don't need to spend an hour a day with yourself. Eventually you might. But you could start with baby steps. Start with 10 minutes. I'm sure you're awake for 16, 17 hours a day. You can find 10 minutes, and you could start with things that don't have really to do with I don't know, being in solitude, so to speak. You could just spend 10 minutes at the beginning reading from a book, if that's something you like to do. You could listen to music for 10 minutes and just close your eyes and relax. You could maybe, as you are driving to work, instead of fighting with everybody in the street and looking at the time and, oh, I'm going to be late, and getting all frustrated, you could take 10 minutes of that drive to just listen to some music and actually daydream a little bit, you know. Most of you are going to be stuck in traffic anyway, so it'll be easy and you won't be driving fast, hopefully. Don't daydream and drive fast, okay? But just a thought. And maybe you could take your kid in a stroller for a walk and just, you know, take 10 minutes while you're walking to just get in touch with yourself and your thoughts and your feelings, you know, and maybe intentionally be in solitude and daydream when you are working out, if that's something you like to do, or exercising. So the idea is to live with intention in general, right? And people, you know, have to live with some intention throughout their lives, and to have the intention to enjoy your own company is something that you could also do, and something that is really rewarding. Trust me. And little by little, when you get used to spending a bit of time, like 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, when you start doing that, you will find that you love your own company. And without you noticing, you will increase that time, and you will end up spending more and more time with yourself, and you will spend more and more time with your beautiful thoughts. And without you noticing, you will find your world changing. You will find your life including many more beautiful things that you would like to have in your life, and bit by bit your dreams could come true. So it's really something that kind of flows naturally. You don't really have to work so hard at it sometimes, you know. Just allow yourself some space and some time to think. And this brings me to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Do subscribe to my channel, I remind you again, and I would really appreciate it if you would like or share this episode. And next week's episode is a spin-off of today's topic, and it will be titled Servitude versus Solitude, and we'll discuss that more next time. We're not going to get into it right now, of course. And until then, I wish you a lovely weekend, and have fun. Do daydream. Do find time to think and to be in solitude for a bit. And I send you lots of hugs and lots of love, and stay safe. Bye.